This is the first in our series of videos on the respiratory system, and this is our first set of learning objectives. Number one, to look at the good gases and bad gases. Actually, it's oxygen and carbon dioxide. There you go. There's learning objective number one. Number two, and this is probably the most important part of the lecture, is to identify the three places where gas exchange must happen. And we're going to trace drops of air, trace drops of, when I say air, I really should say oxygen here. This really should read oxygen from the environment into your brain and carbon dioxide from the brain back to the environment, as well as look at a membrane thickening problem. We want to just identify some simple anatomy of the upper and lower respiratory tracts, as well as identifying the three parts of the pharynx. So here we go. So let's start off. The good gas is oxygen and the bad gas is carbon dioxide. And when I mean, maybe good and bad is not really the best term, but what I really mean is the thing that we really need for good physiological purposes, like making ATP, that would be oxygen. And then the so-called bad gas. And bad is, again, maybe a tough thing to say because it does play a role in determining the pH of our blood. But I say bad in the sense that this is the gas that we end up eliminating. Okay, we breathe it out. So we breathe in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide. And we'll look at that in much more detail. So number two is really the critical thing. And so this is kind of a master slide, because what this is showing you is it's showing you exchange number one. And so again, keep in mind, what are the three places where gas exchange must happen? So I'm about to show you three of them. So exchange number one is right over here, and that is getting gas to come from the atmosphere or the environment, meaning the air in your room, the air outside when you're taking a walk, getting air from out there into your lungs. That's the first exchange that must occur. The second exchange, exchange number two, is how do we get oxygen from the lungs into the blood? And that's what we're seeing here. This big old purple sac-like thing is actually representing the lungs. So again, number one is how do we get oxygen from the atmosphere into the lungs? Number two, exchange number two, is how do we get oxygen from the lungs into the blood? Now from there, at this point, you should know all the stuff that occurs, right? There's blood returning through the pulmonary veins back into the left atrium and the left ventricle that gets pumped out of the aorta. How does blood move? Blood moves according to pressure gradient, and we know all those mechanisms now that generate these pressure gradients. So, okay, great. That is transport of gases in the blood. All of this right here that I'm circling with the cursor is the cardiovascular system. So then from there, when we finally get to the tissues, look, you've seen already what goes on at capillaries. We saw hydrostatic pressure counteracting with colloidosmotic pressure at the arterial and the venous end of the capillaries. But here we're going to talk in more detail about pressure gradients of the gases themselves. So this is exchange number three. How do we get oxygen to go from the capillaries into the tissues? Okay, so one more time, exchange number one is getting oxygen from atmosphere to the lungs. Exchange number two is getting oxygen from the lungs to the blood. Again, this is in the pulmonary circulation. This is all cardiovascular system. And exchange number three is how do we get oxygen from the blood into the tissues? Now, if you go back the other way, if you just accept for now that carbon dioxide is considered waste, then the same question emerges. Well, how do we get carbon dioxide from the tissues into the blood? And then cardiovascular system brings that back and sends it up to the lungs. How do we get carbon dioxide from the blood into the lungs? And then from there, how do we get carbon dioxide from the lungs out back into the atmosphere when we breathe this thing out? So these are the three exchanges. So really, if nothing else, at the end of this video, you should be able to just either look at this slide and talk about it, or without it, just be able to sketch it out. You should be able to describe these exchanges that occur. Okay, these are the three critical exchanges. Okay, so while we're at it, let's go ahead and trace a drop of oxygen from the environment into your brain cell, and we'll do the same thing with carbon dioxide. And really all we need to do is label this. It says blood to cells. Let's just call it a brain cell. So oxygen comes from the atmosphere into the lungs, which then goes into the pulmonary vessels. From there it goes back to the left atrium, left ventricle, out the systemic circuit. It moves out of the arterial end of the capillaries into the tissues, and there we have it. And now then moving on to this next part, trace a drop of carbon dioxide from the brain cell into the environment. Well, again, keep in mind this was our brain cell. So carbon dioxide is produced by the brain cell as a result of doing the citric acid cycle and produces a whole bunch of ATP, as well as that weird transitional step, right? Decarboxylation of pyruvate. In any case, carbon dioxide is produced. Carbon dioxide enters into the venous end of the capillaries. From there, it enters back into the systemic circuit, eventually back to the right atrium, right ventricle, into the pulmonary circuit, which then goes into the alveoli, which is part of the lungs, and then out into the environment. So there we have it. We have now just traced oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now, what's going to be your problem if the membrane around the lung became very, very thick? Now, here's what I mean. See this purple thing right over there? this purple thing, let's say that got super duper thick. Like right now, I don't know, I'm looking at the screen, let's call it 4 millimeters. Okay, so now all of a sudden this thing goes from 4 millimeters to 16 millimeters. What's your problem? Well, what your problem is should be fairly intuitive to you, because what have I just done? I've taken this thing over here and I've made it massively thick. I've made that this massively thick wall, which is going to make it very difficult for oxygen or carbon dioxide to diffuse. And so the alveoli of the lungs are actually, we'll see it again in a future video, but we'll see that it's actually a very thin membrane so that gases can easily diffuse across that membrane. And if the membrane itself becomes too thick, then that becomes just, you can't do it. You can't diffuse across a thick membrane. So this next part then is, let's just get through some anatomy. If you look at some anatomy, we divide the airways into the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract. So if we just kind of call some of these things out, in the upper respiratory tract is the nose and then the nasal cavity behind it. It actually also includes the pharynx itself, which we'll divide up, or we'll zoom in on in a bit. It includes the larynx. This larynx is sometimes called the voice box, and so but you can't. You got to call it the larynx. And then from there, actually that's it. That is the entire upper respiratory tract. When we get in the lower respiratory tract, what we see then is this big, huge cartilaginous pipe, and this is the trachea, which splits off into bronchi, and each of those bronchi are going to split off into smaller bronchioles. So this is not unlike how arteries split off into smaller and smaller arterioles. Eventually, they end up in the lung tissue itself. Okay, so there's the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract. Within the lungs itself, the exchange unit, meaning that the place where exchange of gases actually occurs, is this thing called the alveoli. Alveoli is plural, alveolus is the singular version. So now that I've formally introduced that term, the alveoli are really balloon-like structures, tiny little mini balloons within the lungs. And really, when you look at the lungs as a whole, the lung is nothing but a whole bunch of tiny little balloons all kind of connected together. And so those tiny little balloons are the alveoli. So eventually we end up at the alveoli, and this right here is where gas exchange occurs. Now, the question I put up here is, how does this pathway differ from the cardiovascular system? Well, I think it's fairly straightforward, but you may not know exactly what I'm going after. So what I'm going after is this. If you go and look at the cardiovascular system, you'll notice that it's a big loop. And you've noticed that previously, right? It's a big loop. There's continuity all the way throughout this cycle. It really is a big circle. It's like almost like a big giant racetrack. And it never, there's no real beginning or end to it. And I suppose from a certain point of view, you might say the heart is the beginning and end, but we're just kind of making that up, right? Meaning it's a big giant loop. But when you look at the respiratory system, it is not a loop. So what that means is air is going to come in, air is going to come in one way. And let me draw an arrow there just to say that right there is our air coming in. So this arrow is representing air coming in. So air comes in, here it is through that arrow. It's going to come in either through the mouth or the nose. And you all know that, right? You learned as a very young kid that you can plug up your nose and breathe through your mouth, or cover up your mouth and breathe through the nose. And why is that? Because ultimately both the nasal and oral cavity are going to converge right back here in part of the pharynx. So I move the arrow here to show you that that arrow goes down, it goes to the trachea, and then eventually makes its way out into the lungs. Now from there, what ends up happening is that when you have to get carbon dioxide out, then what we see is everything just goes in reverse. So I put a red arrow here to indicate carbon dioxide. It takes the same roads that oxygen took to get in. It takes the same pipes, then makes its way up through the trachea, makes its way out of the larynx, back into the oral or nasal cavity, and then eventually out you go, back out into the environment. So these are really one-way roads, I suppose you could say it that way. Air comes in, and then when you breathe out, air goes out the exact same way. Whereas the cardiovascular system, as I said, is a big continuous loop. All right, so that's the key difference between this pathway, the respiratory pathway versus cardiovascular pathways. I realize I forgot to, how does this exchange happen? How do each of these exchanges occur? Your knee-jerk response needs to be pressure gradient, because here's the thing, gases move according to a pressure gradient. Just like we saw fluids move to a pressure gradient, gases also move according to a pressure gradient. Okay, let's look at a little bit more anatomy. When you look at more anatomy, there's the trachea again. It separates out, it splits off into a right bronchus and a left bronchus. And what you're going to see here is, as I said before, they're going to now start dividing out. So we call this a primary bronchus, and then you get into secondary bronchi and tertiary bronchi as well too. It's not so important to me that you memorize these terms secondary and tertiary, as long as you understand that the bronchi themselves, bronchi is the plural version of bronchus, the bronchi will end up splitting off just like arteries split off into arterioles, okay? Now you'll see again, they come in here and they essentially reach dead ends, which is where those balloon-like alveoli live. And again, when carbon dioxide returns or goes out, it goes out through the exact same path. Okay, so let's look up here at the nasal cavity. A couple things that I want to point out, and I don't have this in your learning objectives, but you really need to know it. It was just an oversight, but it should be included in here. In the anatomy of the upper and lower respiratory tracts, is you should include the word concha. What do the concha themselves actually do? While we're at it, you might as well include the word tonsils as well. Okay, because we're going to see those in a second. Okay, so when we look at the nasal cavity, what we see is the superior nasal concha, middle nasal concha, and the inferior nasal concha. These should kind of ring a bell because you saw them in the first part of the course, Bio 141. You know that the inferior nasal concha was its own bone, and the superior and middle nasal concha were part of the ethmoid bones. And so what are these things there for? They're there because as air comes in, it hits these bumps and it creates a bunch of turbulence, so air starts swirling around. Well, this entire nasal cavity is lined with a mucous membrane, and so when you swirl this air around, it serves a couple of purposes. The first role, when I say first, I don't mean most important, just the way I'm listing them out. The first role is this is going to warm up the air, because this is a warm environment in here. The second role is that it's going to humidify the air. If you've ever been out on a really super cold day, like cold, dry winter day, you know that when air is super dry, it's kind of irritating to your nasal cavity. Some of you may put humidifiers in your bedrooms at night during the winter time, because when things get real dried out, you can crack and bleed here and things like that. So nobody likes that. So it warms up the air, humidifies the air. And number three, it helps clean the air a little bit because this mucous membrane, again, it's lined with mucus all over the place, so it can help trap any particulate matter that we don't want depositing on airways. So consider this: if air comes in, and let's say the air makes its way down here, and that air is kind of dirty, meaning that there's a whole bunch of, let's say there's been wildfires and there's a bunch of ash in the air or whatever it might be, then now those things actually end up depositing in the lungs. And when they deposit in the lungs, we don't like that. That's bad. And so your immune system typically tries to fight that. Where the immune system goes, oftentimes there's some inflammation and kind of fluid accumulation, things like that. And then we call that pneumonia. And so obviously that's not good. So these nasal conchas serve an important role in creating turbulence so that we have time, and increases the opportunity for that air to mix, contact the mucous membrane for all those things to occur. All right. The other thing that we see, let me zoom out just a little bit. When we zoom out, we do see a pharyngeal tonsil right back over here, a pharyngeal tonsil. And if you go down below, we do see palatine tonsils right back here in the oropharynx. And so what are tonsils? Without getting into a lot of depth, tonsils for now are just collections of immune cells. Okay, we can look at that a little bit more when we go into the immune system itself, but these are really pockets of unencapsulated lymphoid tissue, which just means there's a bunch of immune cells there, so that if there's anything that enters into the nasal cavity, oral cavity, then right at the gates, right before you go any further into the rest of the body, we've got some immune cells right there to do whatever it is that they need to do. Okay, so let's see where we are. Let's see, we covered number 1, we covered number 2, we covered number 3. The last thing I want to do then is cover the different parts of the pharynx. So when you look at the pharynx, what is the pharynx? The pharynx is this part way at the back of the nasal and oral cavity. Okay, so that's the pharynx. The pharynx is broken up into 3 parts, and this is a very nice picture here where if you come in through here, this is obviously nasal cavity, this is the oral cavity, but this entire region is the pharynx. And so we divide into 3 parts. First is the nasal part of the pharynx, which is the nasopharynx. Next is the oral part of the pharynx, which is the oropharynx. And the last part is right behind the larynx. The larynx we'll take a little bit of a closer look later, but the larynx is this, again, so-called voice box. It is the portal of entry if you want to get into the trachea. And so right behind there, that part is also part of the pharynx. It's called the laryngopharynx. So the 3 parts are the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. And you see that again right over here. Nasopharynx is right around here behind that nasal cavity. The oropharynx is right around there behind the oral cavity. Laryngopharynx right behind the larynx. Okay, so to wrap it up, we've covered the good and bad gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, respectively. We've traced drops of airs. We talked a little bit about what would happen if the membrane got real thick. We looked at the anatomy of the upper and lower respiratory tracts and identified parts like the concha as well as the tonsils. And then finally, we identified the 3 parts of the pharynx. So that'll wrap it up for video number 1.